one of the things I thought would be interesting to reflect on or think about was, and I know it'd be really important for lots of people here, is just the real importance of that you've built up around the community of publication and what you've done, and that's grown and gone from strength to strength. And I just wondered, it's a really sort of open, generative question, I hope, which you can disagree with, but I hope it isn't one you could disagree with really. But just in terms of, I know people here are involved in publishing networks, making things happen, and just when you look back over the years that you've been making things happen, making events happen, bringing people together, making your work speak to issues, what advice would you be giving to?
Well, I think, you know, I realize what you're saying is true. And as I've gotten older, I realized what a mistake that was.
Right.
Yeah. The view I found detestable when I was young, of the poet totally involved with themselves, somewhat cranky, expecting other people to do things for them, but being hostile to the very people that have done those things, so that they can shore up their imaginative resources in private. This was the correct view.
Yeah.
My hostility to that was an idol of one of my youthful idols that I have now cast aside. But you know, that is so much the view, especially I'm sure it's here in the UK, but since I'm in the US, it's a kind of 50s, 60s dominant American view of the individual who is somehow contaminated when they do things or even kind of get their hands dirty in a way with publication, with small press. You know, my whole, for one thing, it isn't true of almost any poet, actually. People may take that stand, but I mean, most poets are involved with other poets to survive, because it's such a deeply unpopular medium that how would you get along? In fact, you know, most poets, and it's certainly true in the UK as well, or even poets who are published by trade presses and are successful, those very few, are still to some degree dependent upon independent or small presses. You know, almost all poetry thrives on that. No matter, there's almost very few people are outside that, and those people are exceptions that are who can't be. And that's, of course, it's so different than other modes of culture, especially commercial culture. So I mean, one of the distinctions I make is that poetry is a fundamentally non-commercial culture. If you think about how you can somehow make money from it, which is understandable, people have to live, in a way it makes things harder. My advice is always try not to lose too much money. I think this is very important for people involved with community. Stephen, this is a guy who's lost much too much money. You didn't take my advice for your books with just the scale of it. You see the number of books that Stephen Mooney just put out now, and you figure, boy, you know, that he's not staying even, but he has the support of friends and other people who keep him afloat. I hope. But it's just you know, to do something of that scale. So really, in order to thrive, you have to see yourself in connection to other people whose work you share and support. I remember people used to always criticize the circle I was in. You know, the group of people that I was involved with, we're not old friends. They're not old college friends or people who knew each other or were even friends other than, you know, became friends through their work. People who had a shared, more like political comrades, which is the way we viewed it. And there's a lot of hostility to that. People say so much that you just support, you know, your friends and so on, as opposed to saying you support people who have poetic values that you support, which is what they were saying. It was always viewed as being, or even publishing yourself. I published my first 2 books myself, even before there was an expression, DIY. You know, the first one was did on my manual typewriter, not even perfectly typed, 40 copies, Asylum, and gave it to friends of mine. But there was I didn't even think of anything else. Second book too. The third book I did was Douglas Messerly. Uh, it was his first book. He went on to do Sun and Moon and Green Integer. It still remains one of my closest friends. He did a book of shade with a cover of Susan's.
Maybe I can just bring Susan in there, because obviously you had such an influential input into what language looked like and what meaning looked like, and that's obviously a design aesthetic and image here.
Well, I mean, we were trying to
shaping
do
it.
it, as he says, the cheapest way possible. So that was actually the aesthetic. The aesthetic was to make it look okay and readable, but we were still, as he said, language was typed, and we just cut it up and pasted it down on boards. This was all very, now seems incredibly pre-computer and very primitive. So, and even the language logo, which I did, I just had to do it with press type, and then I had to try to get the equal signs in order. I still look at it now, it's still crooked. You know, I couldn't get it right, you know, even though I was working as a commercial designer, but I was a low level one, you know, so, but it turned out okay, you know. And then for meaning, which I did for 30 years, that language was only 4 years, but it was the predecessor. We first did that when we started on a Mac, and we were pasting up and all that. So they were labors of love. I mean, it wasn't a moneymaker, that's for sure. Kind of a money loser, really.
There's a facsimile of language that just came out from the University of New Mexico Press, and which is great. And so they reproduced the full issue and do indexes, which we never had. And the editors can call it a newsletter, which I guess is what we called it. But I think that speaks to your initial question, because for us, people have different imaginations of what that magazine. I actually had copies with me, but I didn't bring them. It's an extremely modest.
Yeah, we meant to bring some.
It's an extremely modest publication, in which was $4 for 6 issues in 1978. And I had an index card for each person who subscribed to it. And this speaks exactly, it's a very specific, when you talk about community or whatever other term you might use, of course, those are right words, but I mean, I'm going to talk about a list of people, the number of people who were interested. I knew the names and the addresses, and we mailed them out to those specific people. And then we occasionally reprinted. One of the things that we did, which I think speaks very much to where I am now. One of our supplements was Chris Cheek, who's actually now was in the United States for a while, is moving back. I guess he'll move to France. But anyway, he's given up his job in the U.S. where he was for a while. But Chris was, for those of you who don't know who Chris Cheek is, incredible young poet and performance artist in the 70s. He's somewhat younger than me.
Oh, I want to say something about 1986 when I started meaning, was that we also had, we were so excited when we sent out our flyer, and I think it was Hannah Weiner who subscribed, and I couldn't believe, I actually didn't know we'd get past the first issue, because once I had a subscription for a whole year, that means I had to put out a second issue, you know, and this kept going because then we had subscribers. Once we had subscribers, I felt like I had to put the issues out, but we only came out twice a year. But, you know, it made a difference, and we had a little red box with the names and addresses of everybody who subscribed, and they were like very important people to us. You know, these people that would give us money, you know, to send out an issue. So I think it was very personal, is what Charles was saying.
And yeah, I mean, that issue of subscriber, I wouldn't have thought that, but that's the word. It's like a list of names. I mean, things are very different right now in the way things are distributed, but it's not that long ago, and you all know that we're talking about the technology, Xerox technology, Selectric typewriter. What Chris did, though, was to give, and we made an entire supplemental issue, was a list of UK small press with 4 or 5 contributors in each issue, closely typed. And I'm sure we just picked up what he typed, because we would have been too hard to reproduce. And it was long. It's like a 40-page. It's a little bit like what you're doing internationally. So Chris just, you know, gave us, in a way, what you could say was the community by listing the magazines and the addresses and several contributors. And when you look at those lists, you know, you begin to see, that's why the reading in the language book and so on, a lot of stuff you'd see from Language magazine, if you know what that is, would be poetics. It would be essays that could seem like they're somewhere else, but the magazine itself was always filled with addresses, prices, and lists of names. We always had the list of names. So if you looked at it, you would see the configurations of, and meaning in actually a more challenging environment, as challenging as poetry is, the visual art world.
Well, it was also weird because we did a visual arts magazine without any pictures. And that because we couldn't afford them. So like you either had to read it or you didn't read it, you know, it was like a lot of things, people just liked the covers. They were always a different color. And I don't know, some people, they just got it, you know, but there was no pictures. So an art magazine without pictures is.
Well, and also breaking into the
strange.
art world doing that. And also a lot of poets wrote, which is a tradition, but a lot of poets contributed
That's true.
to
both,
meaning,
yeah.
and also they wrote in a way that was more related to poetic thinking than the commercial art magazines would allow. So, but you know, but things go beyond what your initial contact is. But I'm
Yeah.
answering the question in a very kind of nuts and bolts way.
So was it a deliberate attempt to be international right from the start, or was there a sense that you wanted to make, because in a way, I mean, the Jeff being part of that as well, and other people in the room too, contributing to that sense of what it meant internationally.
So Jeff, I mean, because we're talking with this conference with Eric Mottram, who is an important figure within this context, was Eric Mottram, who taught at King's College. I think it was like 50 feet from here or something like that. I don't really understand the structure of this neighborhood, but it's not, it's slightly away, but it's still near enough by. He, like Jerry Rothenberg, who we celebrated this weekend, Jerry's 90th birthday, was very involved in reading American poetry here and promoting American poetry here, just as Jerry was doing anthologies both of poetry not considered within the first, second, or third world, non or analphabetic poetries of indigenous people, as well as radical poetry. So he was assembling historically, and that was an important model. You know, it's, you know, what is it, kind of think local, or think, you know, act local, think globally. With so many different strains of people involved. I think in New York, in San Francisco, I would say that the concern there was more for San Francisco and to some degree the US, because it was a bigger group. In New York, there were very few people interested in what we were doing. And I was, as well as Bruce Andrews, my co-editor, as well as Susan in the art context, you know, we were thinking of the 20th century and the art and poetry, you know, very much outside the US. And I was very phobic to the American-centered frame within American poetry. You think about in the UK, there was a resistance. Oh, so I was going to say about Jeff. He wrote, I think, was pretty much the first monograph that was outside of our poetry culture. In other words, my mailing list and all of that, we exchanged stuff. But the first thing that was actually from something that was outside of that, and actually, you were published in Language too, of course.
Was,
yeah. So it's just funny. Yeah, we were talking about this with the Mottram Rothberg. So with these kinds of connections. Yeah. Right in the first, you were published right in the first volume. But in addition to that, you wrote for the British Association of American Studies, something like that. BAS.
Yes.
No, it's a wonderful book actually, in which, you know, you read that. It's like what Susan was saying when somebody said, when Jeff wrote that, I thought, wow, he really, you know, gets it. But he was not part of our community. That's why but he quickly, well, although we did publish him, you see, so there it is.
But the thing is that it was all done by slow boat, you know, because there was no internet
compendium
and no
books.
computers. So, you know, I mean, I feel like I'm in the horse and buggy age or something. Like everything went through the mail, and we called people to get them to give us stuff. You know, and I hound people on the phone. You know, please contribute, because it was art. We were trying to get artists to write, and that was really hard to get them to write, you know, and a lot of them were terrible writers too. To like edit them too. So, you know, it was like, pulling teeth, a lot of it.
And you also wanted to have, other than the typical gender of
Yeah, I
people
mean,
contributing
it
to
was a
this.
feminist magazine with men.
But it didn't, some men, I contributed.
He contributed, there were exceptions.
But also writing about motherhood and the
We did
space
the
of that.
motherhood issue, that was number 12, yeah. It's all up, everything is on scanned and on, it's on a site through Penn. And then we went into, so we did this till 2002, and then in 2002, we went online and did so we started to have pictures. That was a big difference, because once we could afford, we didn't need to afford anything to do it on the internet, you know? So we could have pictures, and that really changed everything, I think. And we could have more contributors. So we did that for 2002 to 2016, I think. And then we both collapsed. My co-editor,
Oh,
Laura
yeah,
Shore,
well,
and
but
I,
you're still, yeah.
we just couldn't do it anymore. I mean, we could have kept going. People said, "Aren't you going to do another issue?" And I said, "No, it's enough." Yeah.
That think again with Jeff and him writing that externally, there's, but also his stuff on the New York School. People sometimes call the New York School a code of read. So, I mean, the New York School is like 3 or 4 people, wonderful poets, coming up in a very different environment than we were, because we're post-war. I mean, that's the fundamental difference is that those of us who were editing it were born after the Second World War. I turned 18 in 1968. It's just a very different sense of organizing and how to collect. I think for the people of the generation before, although Rothenberg was an exception, they needed to be in smaller enclosed groups just to protect themselves from being literally destroyed, especially the gay men. It just wasn't possible. I think especially Spicer and San Francisco and Duncan and Blazer. So but we didn't have that. It was a different time. But I am always afraid that poetry groups become insular, and I'm in a funny way, and I think many of my old friends would say that's a problem. I'm not sort of interested in just the configuration that I had in 78 or 6 or 82 or 85. That's just a springboard to find out what's going on beyond that. And it's certainly true I've become much more non-US focused. I mean, as with Coco Fett and his friend Sayer Lynn, who just fantastic poets.
Yeah.
And one of the, I've saying this, Jeff, one of the most amazing things that happened to my whole life really was when, what's his name, your co-editor of, actually, remember, it's the British poet of some sort.
Oh, James Byrne.
James Byrne.
Yeah.
Who still is teaching in the north of England.
Yes, in Liverpool, yes.
Liverpool. Terrific guy. So James Byrne comes to me one day to visit, and he brings me a book that was published in Burma, Myanmar, of my essays translated into Burmese. Now, from reading the New York Times and the Guardian, it seemed like it was a closed place. It was during the military dictatorship, the previous one. And then it was 5 years before, nobody had sent it to me. And it just seemed amazing. I thought, wow, this is really what's possible with that book. Then I met Sayer Lynn, and I figured out, like with Coco Fett, had more in common, which I do with them than I have with most Americans. Why wouldn't I? So I'm saying my phone, I'm that's in common with myself. So, I mean, to me, the national boundaries are, I think of Caroline too, when I first met her, and she was actually, I remember discussing this with her for maybe just like how she was describing herself for Contributors Note. And it was sort of interesting, what she came up with, how she described it, because when I first knew about Caroline Bergwall, she was described as a British poet or a UK poet very early, when like the very first Contributors Notes, maybe. But of course, it turned out that she was a non-national poet in the work, and it became possible to sort of, describe her as Chaucer's part of the coterie of Chaucer, or something like that. I mean, part of the point of poetic thinking is to break those distinctions down while realizing that we all exist within bodies, national and class. I mean, we're very much controlled by those things. But the thinking is to try to think across those things, and the collectivities that we create are necessary to resist them, but they're not to be reified for themselves as our so-called communities, our neighborhoods, our coteries, or even our, even our friends to some degree. Although, you want to support your friends, but even to me, friendship is not the most, it's significant, but it's not the fundamental value that I'm interested in the connections. With the art world that Susan is involved with, again, the calculus is more complicated because we don't have really the large moneyed interests of galleries and so on that we're
Well, there is
contending
a
with.
large money interest in galleries that basic. I mean, we never had any advertising in our publication, which would have been a way to keep it going. But, and we also never took salaries. We just did it as a side thing. So it really was a labor of love, and everybody who contributed just gave us what they, we would ask a question usually, and then people would write in an answer. And so it seems like that actually a lot of other publications have picked up that format strangely, but it really worked for us. And it allowed us to get a much broader range of people than we knew. Like we would write to people we didn't know. For our racism issue, we wrote to 150 people and got 15 answers. Nobody wanted to answer the questions, but it was okay because the people that answered were like people that wanted to deal with this matter, So, I think, and the broader people who were asked the question also sort of became part of the community. So I think there's a lot of ways to make a community when you do that kind of publication.
And I was just thinking about the way that the topsy-turvy, some of the poems in there are structured around dialogue, stylogics,
Right.
And answering back and making the self not necessarily even refract, but being conversation
Well,
beyond itself.
You
itself.
quoted from that one a little bit the line where it's, well, I started to do that even with my joke about the answer, that each section contradicts whatever the first statement is, the next one undercuts that. So, but of course, that itself is an aesthetic. I mean, it's not. That's not that anything goes. It's a very specific aesthetic but still that allows for questioning of propositional kinds of terms. But the questioning of propositional terms as an aesthetic formula or ideological solution is itself a point of view.
Yeah.
Which most people don't have and are against. So I mean, it's not.
But the discursive nature of the
Right,
possibilities.
but that questioning of that discursiveness is itself, it's a position, it's a view. It's not free of position. It's not without. It's not amorphous. It's actually quite on the contrary. It's contestatory, and that's what interests me. But it also, it's to my mind, it's a way of understanding what anti-authoritarian thinking can be, and it's which is a fundamental resource. I don't think it's the only resource in the culture, but it's one thing that poetry can contribute to the culture it's in is the significance of anti-authoritarian, that last poem I had a question mark to read the father, of what I'd say, but I mean it's Trump, of course, this is and people love that in the United States. A good number of my fellow citizens, they love that, COVID, you don't need to wear a mask. I tell you, it's like, and Putin as well. Ukraine, that's not a country. Burmese people, we're going to call it Myanmar, and we're going to make you feel bad that you're not saying Myanmar, even though we created that term. I mean, that was one thing I learned in a conversation with Coco. The very name that's native is meant to appeal. This is true because maybe I'm getting it wrong, but it's to some degree made to appeal to people who want to be anti-colonialists. It's created by the military to be an attractive local color name.
Wow.
Myanmar. So you say that because you want to be correct, but what you're saying is it's a double, and there's nothing wrong with Myanmar either, by the way. I mean, but it's just, these are complicated things. And people who invent these things are often very cruel and mean and manipulative, and they can use things for the good, but for the bad as a kind of rebranding. So Burma, of course, is the English name, but at the same time, it's a name that you prefer to say Burma. Is that right?
I'm not sure, yeah.
Yeah, well, you're not sure. Well, that's it. No,
Yeah.
that's the best answer. That's what I'm saying. And you, would you prefer
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
You prefer.
Mhm.
But it's just, it's an issue is all I'm saying. It's not without its